The US has said, hey, making money, growing our economy, becoming financially wealthy has been a priority, and society has followed that. And you can look at our GDP per capita. The United States GDP per capita is incredible considering how large the country is. And a big portion of that is because we have almost everybody working, men and women.
In the US, weekly churchgoers average 2.1 children per woman. And for non-attendees of church, it's 1.5. All things being equal, there's a difference between people who attend church and people who do not.
In 3 generations, Japan will have 5% of their current population if current birth rates stay the same. So we're talking about an end of a society there if they don't step up their baby making game.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. In this podcast, we dive into the world of adventure, investing, geopolitics, entrepreneurship, and more. My name is Brawner. I'm here with my co-host, Cody Shirk. Cody's back in Florida after a trip to New York City. I'm back in Lake Oswego, Oregon. And man, how's it feel back in Florida?
It's good to be back in Florida. New York's great. And I took the kids on the first time trip to New York. I feel like they're just old enough where we can walk a long way and they're not, darting into the street. And it was fun, man. It was super fun. It was like seeing a new place through new eyes. My son, who's 5, looks up the building. Daddy, how did they build that? And, good question, dude. That is a very good question. And this is a long story.
Not a question I have the answer to.
No, I don't have the answer specifically, but this is something that should inspire you for life to know that humanity can do this. And, in Florida, we're in flat land, not much as it pertains to huge infrastructure. But for my kids, for seeing that for the first time, super inspirational. And we went out to a lot of exotic food places. They did great, ate all kinds of strange food, and they were inspired, I would say. So it was a great trip.
Yeah, it's interesting. Inspiration can happen at any age. When I was 21, I was living in Macau. I lived in Macau for a year. And at that time, and still today, like the building that was happening there was unfreaking real. Like I could see from my apartment complex into another skyscraper that was being built into the job site. And they were building 24/7. So all night they'd build, and it was going up incredibly fast. And my grandfather at the time came to visit. He wanted to come and visit me, and he'd never been to Macau before. He'd spent a lot of time in Asia, but he'd never been to Macau. So he planned this trip, and he went up and he saw the Three Gorges Dam, and then he came and visited me. And basically what he wanted to do was go look at all the construction sites and all the things that were being built. And his takeaway from growing up in the 50s was he was like, I'm so inspired being here. They are building again. They are building the type of stuff that I remember when I was younger being built in America. Massive bridges, infrastructure. I would just take him around and we go look at these huge, huge infrastructure projects. And he was an engineer and he loved it. And that was his biggest takeaway. So he was like, wow, we're in a place that's building again. So no matter how old you are, it can be incredibly inspirational.
Absolutely. Didn't China consume more concrete in a decade than the United States did in a century? I don't know the statistic, but it's something crazy like that.
I would imagine that sounds right. I mean, just the scale of some of the things that are going on and some of the bridges that were being built, even when you go there, it's just like, wow, everything's 3 times, 10 times the size. But today, so we wanted to dive in because last week we did an episode. We talked about birth rates, declining birth rates worldwide, and what role the government plays in inspiring people to have children, or on the flip side, kind of restricting birth in different societies. And we got a lot of thoughtful responses to that episode, and we wanted to dive back into that and go and look at it through a different lens today.
And also, I want to add that this theme is probably the largest theme in the world that everyone pretty much agrees on, which is population growth is slowing. This is a known. This isn't even really a debatable fact.
It's a known.
Yep. And there's all kinds of second and third order consequences of this happening, but we're more or less not doing anything to address this. I think the only person who's really vocal about this is Elon Musk, and he's obviously a very polarizing person right now.
There's other people that are talking about, but people at the highest level.
For sure. And he talks about that's the biggest crisis. And I think when you hear him say that, a lot of people just kind of slough it off like, oh, this is not something that impacts my life today or even in 5 years. But for someone who's younger or older, or someone who's got grandkids, or you have kids yourself, this is going to start playing out in the next decade or so in real ways. And there's lots of areas in the world that are going to be impacted more, significantly more, and some areas of the world that may not be impacted really at all. And that's what we want to find out, because with all of that comes opportunity.
And with that opportunity, tied into that, there's a lot of benefits of living in a place where the population is growing. And there's a lot of downsides to living in a place where the population is decreasing. And that's like just from a very practical perspective of not a lot of people to support the elderly people population. And then there's also just more of a like mental health side of you can go across the Rust Belt in the US and you feel less optimism in places where the cities are shrinking, and more optimism in the places where the cities are growing.
It's inspiring versus demoralizing. And for me, I'm in this tiny bubble in Florida here. I haven't lived here my whole life, but when I first moved here, it's all retirees and pretty uninspirational. Not a lot of big events or things happening. Over the past couple of years, it's completely changed. There's young people here. It's inspirational. I don't have to travel far to access people who are doing exciting things and building big projects. So in this little bubble, I've seen it happen. But of course, there's countries and regions of the world that are where this is happening on a macro scale.
So let's dive in here. And the first question we want to talk about is, like you said, birth rates dropping. But why? And what does religion have to do with this? Because we want to start and kind of frame this around the context of what's happening in the places where the birth rates are high, and then the places where the birth rates are low, and dive in a little bit. So let's talk about kind of what's happening in Africa, places where the highest birth rates: Niger, Angola, Mali, Chad, Uganda. Talk a little. Are they religious there, Cody? Not religious? What is the correlation between these places with high birth rates and religion?
So there's a very, very noticeable correlation with the rate of people practicing religion, could be any religion, and the birth rate. And this has been historically proven, but it's also in nearly every country you can see higher birth rate with higher practices of religion, and vice versa. So in Africa, the countries that you just mentioned, the top 10 countries in the world with the highest birth rates are in Africa, and they are far and away having more babies than the rest of the world. So Niger, it's about 6.5 children per woman. That's the average. Of course, there's a spread there that there could be women having many more and some many less. But if you think of 6.5 children per woman versus South Korea and Japan, who are having less than one on average child per woman, that's going to drastically impact the future of these countries. But as it pertains to religion, in South Korea, in Japan, where these birth rates are super low, they actually have a very low practice of religion. These people are focusing more on their careers or education and activities that aren't necessarily revolving around the church. Whereas in Africa, the countries, those top 10 countries are predominantly Muslim and some Christian, and they are devout followers of these religions. And the result for that region of the world in Africa is this super high birth rate. And we've seen that in the US historically. It's not that case now, but historically we have seen that in the past.
So some numbers in the African countries that we reported over 90% of people report that religion is very important in their lives. If you go to South Korea, 60% say that they're religiously unaffiliated. Actually, that's in Japan. And 30% in the UK say completely unaffiliated with religion. There are a few exceptions, though. Poland and Italy are both highly Catholic countries, over 80% religious, and they've got low birth rates. So the question we're kind of diving into here is, what is the lever, right? Is religion driving the birth rate? And if so, how much? Or are there some economic conditions that are more impactful than religion? Well, let's dive into the US and give a little bit more context here. So what's happened and how has it evolved? How has religiosity and birth rates, how have they been correlated in the US? And what have, like, you've done some of the research here. How have things changed? What's been the impact? And what are the biggest levers that have changed the birth rate in the US?
So first of all, that's a new word I didn't really know about, and we're going to say that.
Religiosity?
Yeah. Did you know that? Religiosity.
I did know about religiosity.
Okay.
Yes. It's a hard word to pronounce.
It is.
Yes.
I avoided it. That's why I said people who practice religion, but it's religiosity. Anyways, that is how many people in a society practice religion. And so in the US, in the early 20th century, so 1900 to the 1940s, high practice of high religiosity, high birth rates. And this is from a number of factors. A big push for high birth rates was we had massive immigration, specifically from Irish Catholics and Scottish and this region of Europe that was having tons of kids, and they moved for opportunity, came to the US, and they brought their birth rate with them. So everyone knows about the Irish twins saying, which is, I think, what's it, 2 children under the age of two, right? So you're basically like bam, bam, like back to back with kids. But that saying Irish twins became because of the Irish Catholics that had so many kids. So in the US, we had super high birth rate in the early 20th century. And what is the birth rate then? It was around, trying to see what the actual number was.
I think 3 to 4 children per woman.
Right, there it is, 3 to 4 women per children. So then you fast forward a couple more decades, the 1940s to the 1960s. This was the baby boom. So this is the soldiers coming back from World War II, the world kind of saying, oh, this is over. We can have time to build our lives and live in peace. But the birth rate actually, with religion, kind of dropped a little bit. And the birth rate in that time period is around just under 4. So it dropped from the early 19th century in the United States. Fast forward again to the 70s and 90s, and this is, again, more declining practice of religion within the U.S., and the birth rate continued to fall. And in the 70s to about the 90s, it was just around replacement rate, around 2.1. And then towards the 90s, it fell even more to like 1.8. And then fast forward to today, so 2000s till now, the past 25 years, the practice of religion has fallen even more in the US, and birth rates have fallen to about 1.6 right now in the US. Now, again, we're not taking immigration into account. We're just looking for domestically born children within the US from US citizens. And you can see a clear correlation to the people practicing religion. And as religion has decreased over the past century, the birth rates have almost lockstep decrease at the same time. Of course, there's many other factors, but this is the most clear correlation you can look at.
Couple of the big factors that we are looking at, right, that you can take from the other side are contraceptive pill was approved in 1960, right? So that's if you look at from the 60s on, there's a massive decrease in the birth rate. Education.
Yep.
And women, the workforce, women's rights, the workforce participation of women, delayed marriage, all these different things. And some of the questions that we're trying to explore here is, what was the role of the decrease in religiosity versus some of these other things that have happened in society, and which one is more important? And if we look at the future of the birth rate in different societies, is it just going to come down to what the religious societies are growing and non-religious societies are shrinking? or there are other things going on that could potentially impact the future of growth in some of these countries.
And for us as investors, travelers, people looking for opportunity, like we said in the beginning, places that are growing with more people typically have more inspiration, more things being built, but also a society that's just more or less like prosperous. And the opposite can be true as well. But that's why we're interested in this, because we can look at areas of the world right now and say the birth rate's super high here, but there may be not that much opportunity, maybe more conflict, and vice versa. I just wanted to make a quick note that in the U.S. we talked about women's rights and their ability to get educated, where they maybe didn't have that avenue, especially in the early 1900s. They were expected to stay home. They were expected to raise children. Especially during the 70s, there was more openness to encouraging women to go get educated, to have a career. That is something I think the U.S. as a whole has promoted. Take religion out of that. The U.S. has said, hey, making money, growing our economy, becoming financially wealthy has been a priority, and society has followed that. And you can look at our GDP per capita. The United States GDP per capita is incredible considering how large the country is. And a big portion of that is because we have almost everybody working, men and women.
Totally. There's a saying, what gets measured gets managed. And when we think about the measurement from the top down, it really comes down to GDP and output. We're not really looking at a holistic view of what is important to a society. One last stat before we move on to some other countries that kind of buck the trend. In the US, weekly churchgoers average 2.1 children per woman, and it's for non-attendees of church, it's 1.5. So that's being today. Equal, that's today. All things being equal, there's a difference between people who attend church and people who do not.
And so people know, the replacement rate for a population growth must be 2.1 or higher, because to take into account infant mortality or just the idea that a child has to grow up to become a parent themselves, you have to have over 2. So 2.1 is the minimum you have to have for replacement
to
rate.
Maintain a population.
And that's where the U.S. is at right now for churchgoers. For non-churchgoers, we're below replacement rate. And again, that's not taking into account immigration. That's just the birth rate itself.
Totally. There are some interesting countries out there that are doing, they're secular, there's religious countries that have different results and are, let's just say, they're taking a different strategy than the U.S. And so let's go into some of these secular countries that are kind of getting it right. So let's go into you pulled out a couple of good examples. What's going on in Israel?
So
and
Israel,
maybe you want to talk about this Three Little Bears situation that you've kind of come up with.
Yeah, so the Three Little Bears situation, as everyone knows, it's the porridge is too hot, it's too cold, and the middle is just right. And It's probably a life lesson in general, which is, you don't want too much, you don't want too little, you just want just the right amount. And that is absolutely true when it comes to birth rate, because it's pretty obvious if you're not having a high birth rate, you're not going to have enough kids. And South Korea and North Japan have the lowest birth rates right now. I heard a statistic the other day. In 3 generations, Japan will have 5% of their current population if current birth rates stay the same. So we're talking about an end of a society there if they don't, step up their baby making game.
And this is why Elon he gets so much criticism, and I think a lot of it comes down to more of the way it's described than the truth of what he's saying. When he says, hey, this is the biggest challenge that humanity faces, it's because, and this is where he rarely gets things wrong long term, and it's because of this specific scenario. If he's looking out into the future and saying, wait, in 3 generations, Japan's going to have 5% of the population that they have currently, that's clearly a problem. But it's one of those things that it's hard to conceptualize in the moment, the impact of having a much lower than replacement birth rate.
Especially for people that are just going about their day. This is going to happen 3 generations. What do I care about that?
Exactly.
But if you're a country planner or someone looking at empires, like, this is a big deal. So what I just explained, that's the low end. That's the porridge is too cold. That's the 3 little bears situation, low end. The high end, which is the porridge is too hot. This is Africa. This is the top 10 countries with the highest birth rate are in Africa. They're having, on average, more than 6 children per woman. And the issue with that is that if you have too many people being born into a society that does not have an infrastructure, like literal infrastructure, toilets, fresh water, all that, but also a cultural infrastructure of how do we educate these people? How do we have medical care? How do we ensure that these people are growing up to contribute into society in a sustainable,
that they have purpose
way.
They have a plan,
Absolutely.
something to do.
And there's very strong research that shows countries that have super high birth rates like that without this infrastructure end up in massive chaos, civil war, famines, dictators coming to power, just basically the worst thing you could possibly imagine. And this has actually happened for millennia. We can go back to different empires throughout Africa, throughout Europe, throughout Asia. When you have a ton of people being born without purpose, chaos ensues. And if you look at Africa right now, it's sad to say because Africa has had a pretty rough road really for, the past 1,000 years. That's probably what's going to happen more with Africa. You have so many kids being brought into these societies that don't have the proper infrastructure. It's hard to see a scenario where these countries develop in a way where they're going to catch up to the first world standards. So as an investor or somebody looking for opportunity, you may think, oh, wow, Nigeria, super high birth rate, and Nigeria is one of the most successful economies in Africa. But how long is that going to last? You're going to have an enormous amount of people with not much to do unless they emigrate to another country.
And a lot of it comes out of specifically young men, right? When there's a lot of young men with nothing to do, there's a lot of downside to that in society.
And historically,
violence,
historically, that's what war has been about, which is you have a leader of a country with a bunch of young men who's got a ton of testosterone and they want to go out and prove themselves. What do you do with these people? How do you keep them entertained? How do you keep them under control? You bring them into the military and you have them do things. And that is how, Game of Thrones or the Middle Ages, trying to conquer other, parts of the world. That's how you control your populace. You send them out to go fight and bring back the spoils of war. And that's probably what will happen for Africa in the next 50, 100 years, which unless there's some transformation that happens on that continent.
And I'm bullish. I'm bearish on that transformation.
Yeah, I am too. I would like to believe that something great is going to happen, but I can't really see something in the short term. I don't know of any technology or societal, change that's happening that we're seeing that's going to control this population boom there, unless they have massive emigration into other countries that have low birth rates, and then those new immigrants in other countries somehow associate with that new country. But we're seeing this unfold right now in Europe, where we have this problem of immigrants coming into Europe, into a lot of Western Europe, not being able to properly integrate with societies, and there's cultural conflict, and we're seeing this in real time.
And we're at a point now where we're having we're at the highest level of, in Europe, the highest percentage of far right governments are in power since the 1940s. So if you look at a graph of the last 10 years, there's a drastic swing in the direction of far right governments. And almost all of this, most of this is related to the fact that these far right leaders have been talking about the challenges of immigration. And then we're now people in the day-to-day are seeing it in Europe. And well, who are they voting for? They're voting for the people that have been talking about the problem for the last 10 years. And you can see, we talked about this in a previous episode around Denmark. Denmark is not a far right government, but their far left government has been talking about immigration as a problem and making changes. So really, that's like the one thing that people are focusing on. Anyway, let's get to the actual countries that are doing things right, or they're at a healthy level, just right, of replacement birth rate. So let's start with Israel. Talk about what's happening in Israel, and why is Israel the first one that you wanted to call out?
Yeah, forget about whatever's going on in Israel right now, but they have this Three Little Bears scenario. They have a birth rate
just right.
Just right. It's at 2.9 right now, which is pretty good. Their economy is growing. Of course, again, forget about the conflict that's going on right now. Their corruption score is pretty low. Their crime score within their society is pretty low. And they have a somewhat high amount of people who practice religion, of course, the Jewish faith. And Israel, if you look at it just from those metrics, is a country that's in this Three Little Bears perfect situation where you could see them sustaining growth and having their economy work. And that's because their replacement rate is at about 2.9 right now. So the average would be 2.9 kids per woman in Israel.
Meaning they're slowly growing.
They're slowly growing.
Yes.
The next country is Iceland. And it's interesting. In this research we did, a lot of countries came up that I didn't even think about. But Iceland, actually very low practice of religiosity.
Religiosity.
I'm going to butcher this word every single time. Their birth rate right now is around 2.1, 2.2, so just over replacement rate. Their economy is growing. Was at around 4% 2023. Corruption score very low, meaning low corruption. Crime very low. One statistic I found from Iceland though is funny. They have the highest rate of sex, and the only thing I can say about that is just cold there. And what do? You go home and have sex. Maybe they're having babies there because the climate component. All right. Do you want me to go down the rest of the countries, or do you want to?
Yeah, let's talk about some of the other ones. I think it's interesting because countries that you wouldn't expect, like New Zealand. New Zealand's not one. This kind of bucks the trend of religion being the largest component of whether or not a country is above the replacement rate of birth rate. So they have a very low, again, similar to Iceland, low religiosity. But on your hand, they're still doing well, right?
Yeah, their replacement rate's at 2.1, so they are having enough babies to at least grow. Their economy's doing well. Corruption very low. Crime very low. And New Zealand is definitely an outlier, though, as a society as a whole. I mean, they're literally an island. They have a pretty proud native population. Well, not native, but at least they do
have natives as well.
Well, they do, but that's kind of there's a conflict within New Zealand. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but the point is, you have an island nation that is somewhat insulated to the rest of the world. They have a relatively good quality of life, and they have babies, and their economy is doing well. The next country is Georgia, the country of Georgia. Their replacement rate is at 2.2 right now. Economy's been strong. Of course, they've got some exterior issues with Russia always kind of poking them. Corruption, crime, all of that within reason, where you can see their economy continue to grow. And what are they? They're Orthodox there. So
yes,
their religion is very important. 81% of Jordans say religion is very important to their daily life. So this is kind of the opposite of New Zealand, where their birth rate's not super high, but they do have religion in their lives. So there's kind of this.
And you can feel it when you're on the ground in Georgia. Churches are everywhere, and you can see the motion from being in the city of people going from church to whatever on a day-to-day basis. It's very, very interesting. The last one you brought up is Panama, and Panama is at 2.3. And again, GDP growth has been very, very good, averaging 5 to 6% annually. Moderate crime rates, a little bit higher than you want on the corruption scale, but they're doing pretty well. And again, match is very similar to Georgia, where you've got a high religiosity. Around 75% of Panamanians say religion is important, strong Catholic and evangelical influences. So in this situation, you're looking at basically Israel, Georgia, and Panama, all high religiosity, and then Iceland and New Zealand, low religiosity, but all at greater than 2.1 replacement rate.
And not super high. So they're in the Three Little Bears. Great. The porridge is perfect temperature. Yeah. And these 5 countries have this good scenario going on. But the big but here is they're not major countries in terms of population. They're not really dictating the total population of the world. So as an entrepreneur or investor or someone who's looking for a society that's kind of in this good situation, these 5 countries may be an opportunity long term to go get involved, because you know that their society more or less is growing in this healthy manner. But in terms of like a macro perspective, these aren't going to be growing into major world players in the next several decades.
Were you able to find anything about policy differences between Iceland and New Zealand? Like, are they doing anything to encourage people to have children, or is this just an outlier, just something that's random?
It's a subjective observation, and the research that I consumed more suggested that their lifestyle is actually accommodating 2 parents. So in New Zealand and Iceland, you go to a restaurant, you go to a playground, you go to a park, there's things to accommodate children. So the idea of having a family with 2 kids or more is not this huge burden. Society embraces that. We've talked about in the last episode where, in the US and many other countries, especially like Korea and Japan, you can go to a restaurant where they just don't even allow kids, let alone accommodate them. And there's other, parks or activities where there's nothing to embrace the childbearing family. So it's almost like you have a society that's not supporting that. So for those countries, these 5 countries, but the 2 specifically, New Zealand and Iceland, they do have that cultural support for families that do want to have children.
Yeah, it's interesting. Italy stands out for me as one of the biggest confusing countries, because it's got an incredibly low birth rate, also very, very religious, Catholic. And my belief around why, even though religiosity is high, they're not having children, is that I think they really have lost a belief in the future. I think that personally, I think that one of the main reasons that people are having kids or aren't having kids, it's at the core, not necessarily just Christianity or Islam, but it's whether or not there's a belief in the future. And one of the things about Italy is that it's been in a challenging economic situation for a long time. You look at one component, people live at home with their parents until they're much older, right into their 30s. That's going to make it harder to have children. That's one component of it. There's generally a negative outlook on whether or not the future is going to be better than current day. There's struggles related to just making ends meet. It's not, while people in, like, my experience being in Italy with a little kid is that it was incredibly friendly. Everybody was very Italians are so warm and excited to have children around. But I think that the structure of society makes it harder to have children because people aren't making a lot of money. There's not a lot of belief in the future that it's going to be better, and people are living with their parents.
Yeah, you need a North Star in your life. You need some sort of thing that you're working towards. And I think, whatever people think about Trump, that's one of the reasons why he won. He's an inspirational person to some people. He has these big plans. And
the least inspirational person in the world to other people.
Absolutely. But at least you have this leader that in the US is saying all these things that he wants to accomplish. Whereas Italy they're kind of lost at sea. And I think one interesting thing about Italy is there's such rich history there, right? You go to Rome and you can, I remember going there, and I think you can walk 18 miles and see like every single big, the Colosseum, totally. All these churches, and when you're in that society and you're with this rich history, it's almost like, well, what's next? What are we building towards? And there's not much of that in Italy. And a lot of that has to do with also the bureaucracy of Italy itself. The economy is very difficult to grow and have this ladder with rungs that are spread out just the right amount and climate. And you have people if you want to say a tech entrepreneur in Italy, you're coming in America. and you're going to leave. So you have a lot of the bright talent leaving. And like you said too, you have this multi-generational living situation where kids are living with their parents until they're in their mid 30s. Like, you're not going to be raising kids in the same house. Like, it's just
it's going to be
chaos.
It's probably not going to happen, especially because a lot of the structure is based around apartment living.
Yep.
Right? A lot of people live in apartments in cities with their parents until they're in their mid 30s, and that's just going to slow everything down. One thing I want to talk about that I think is interesting is what I've seen personally. What I've seen in my observation is that we have this debate around religion, whether it's, let's just say, good or bad, and some people can decide that it's a negative for society. Some people will say it's imperative for society. My personal view is it's not good or bad. I think that it is inevitable that people will connect with something greater than themselves. And if it's not the church, it gets replaced with something else. And we're seeing this, I think we've seen this in the US with science. And if you look at an education, those two things, we say, okay, religiosity is dropping, traditional religiosity is dropping, but what has been increasing, what has been replacing it? It's this idea and belief in science. And the outcome of some of this is that if you go through the education system in the US, you're going to be taught something different than if you were to go through a traditional Catholic education. And what you're going to be taught, even if it's not blatant and overt, is that we need to have less children to prevent climate change. That's a component of it. And when you have that taking hold in a society, I think the natural, it's not maybe a direct, like in the brain, oh, I can't have a child, but there's somewhat of a subversion of the traditional belief that the most important thing is to grow up, have a family, have children, because you can see that there's negative impacts of humans being on the planet, and we should have less children. So
yeah, but it's also a cultural thing where you ask a teenager, what do they want to do when they grow up, a boy or a girl? And most will say, I want to start a company or be a creator, be an influencer, basically everything, but I want to be a mom or I want to be a dad. Like, kids aren't saying that today. Although my daughter says that. I hope she never listens to this. She's so young, but what do you want to be when you grow up? When I ask her at home, I want to be a mom. I think it's like the coolest thing ever. But if she's out in public or at school, what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, I want to be a veterinarian, or I want to be, something that's what other kids find acceptable. But totally. Saying I want to be a mom, I want to be a dad, like that's just not really culturally acceptable. It's kind of like, oh, what? That's what, you're not going to try something harder? By the way, being a parent is extremely hard. So
it's more challenging than really anything else, in my opinion. Well, like, okay, from your perspective, right? Are we going to have do you see a swing back towards more religion in the US? Is that a positive? Are we just kind of in a situation where secular societies are going to die out and they're going to be completely replaced by the growth of religious nations, and that the future looks like a swing back towards the countries who are more religious having the power because they have more people?
So this is my big prediction for this episode and why I really wanted to talk about it. The answer is yes. It's nuanced, but it's yes. I do think we're going to have a swing back to this religious, spiritual based society. And it's for a number of reasons, which we can dive into. But I think in general, we've reached some sort of bottom, or the pendulum has swung so far to one side, it's going to start coming back the other way. And there's not really any hard evidence to suggest this, other than a recent poll, or Pew Research poll, which indicated that the decline in religiosity.
Religiosity.
Okay, I'm just going to have you say that every time I can't say it. has bottomed the past couple of years. Now, the larger trend is still going down, so this could be like a little blip in the general trend. But over the past couple of years, it has somewhat stabilized, meaning it's not declining anymore. More people are not giving up religion. But then you look at some like influencers or larger celebrities, like Justin Bieber. He's, I don't know, not necessarily as influential as he used to be, but he's, religious now. And you have these people kind of coming around and looking for something that was previously missing in their lives. And I think that the past 10 years, especially the past several years with the pandemic and all that, people have been obsessed with TikTok and Instagram and YouTube and consuming content and more or less filling their lives with garbage and food too. And I think we're going to have this swing back where people realize it's really bad to consume that stuff for you as a person, because you feel somewhat empty at the end of the day. You consume, you're swiping all day long, and then at night you don't feel any more fulfilled. You feel more disconnected from your family and friends. You haven't really accomplished much. And I think society's going to start to notice that, and they're going to look for more things that fill that void. I think religion is going to be part of that. I think there's going to be more in-person priorities, meeting up for a game of volleyball, or go to the beach, or go to the lake, or go for a hike. And whether or not that's specifically correlated to religion, I'm not sure, but I do think there's a spirituality component of that. And maybe this is some sort of awakening or some sort of renaissance, but I do think the pendulum is starting to swing back that other way.
I think it's swinging back, but it's swinging back for, in my opinion, a different way, a different reason. I think if we look at science as religion, right, and we start to examine that question, like, does science fit the same structure or fill the same void that religion has filled for a long time? I think that it has, and people have bought in and had belief in technological progress and science as with the same sort of ferocity that they bought into Christianity or they bought into Islam.
I would disagree with that.
Well, that's fine. Let me go into why I think that I think that it's actually, it's hard to disagree with, and why I think that we're seeing a swing back. I think we saw the peak was it breaking down during COVID, and we watched governments struggle to answer questions they couldn't answer during the pandemic and give out the wrong answers in the name of science. And people were like, interesting. Well, I've had this belief that science is going to solve all these problems. And then we watched it break down in real time. We watched these these figures that we were told were infallible. Let's just give Fauci as an example, a guy who is out there saying, just do this, do this and you're going to be fine. Just take this vaccine, you're going to be fine. Just listen to me. I am science, right? Don't question this. I am the one who has the ideas. And in fact, he was almost completely wrong about everything. And I think people lost a lot of their belief in the whole structure of the ability of science to create the right answers that give them meaning and purpose in their life. And now they're looking for something else. So you disagree?
Well, I agree with you on that, but I think that science was hijacked by Fauci and people science in general is you're supposed to challenge everything, right? That's like the scientific method. You're supposed to, figure out how something works or why something is by challenging it, by testing it, by figuring out why something is the way it is. But when you have an individual person or a government spouting something where there's maybe limited research or facts to prove what they're saying, that's where I think people have lost their trust. It's probably trust in institutions that are based around science. I feel really bad for a lot of scientists who have been canceled or were questioned during the whole pandemic for questioning what was going on, and they're now coming. A lot of those people are now being vilified or justified in their concerns, and so I don't want to lump all of science and just like everyone disregarded science. I think it was people hijack science, but I would also say the same thing with religion, because you look at the Middle East right now with what's going on in Israel and in Gaza and all that. That's more or less a religious war, right? So that's almost like that part of religion.
I don't think it's more or less. It is directly a religious war. Yeah.
Yes. But I guess what I'm getting at is what happened with science during the pandemic and this like turn off from it.
But it's not just during the pandemic, right? It's an unyielding belief in data, right? Mm-hmm. Data-driven decisions, science. Like there is people who are they're not even trusting their own intuition, and instead we're only going to follow the data. And the outcome of that has been people turning off their own observation and their own intuition to only trust things, and because they're being told that the only thing that matters is the scientific method. Mm-hmm. What's the challenge with the scientific method? Well, RFK talks about it all the time. He's like, I've been in court cases where you've got experts from Harvard on one side and experts from Harvard on the other side. And they're debating whether or not on the defense and the prosecution, you've got experts from the same universities coming to different conclusions. And when we're told that you have to, it's quote unquote, follow the data, trust the science, well, there's still within that a level of needing to have your own observational skills to be able to determine what you believe. It's not black or white, and I think that's the challenge and why I think science has moved into and filled the void that religion has traditionally held.
Yeah, I feel like we could debate this forever, and we're kind of getting the weeds of this. But just to summarize or maybe zoom out, I think our society has become more of I'll believe it when I see it, and I'm like that. Like it's hard for me to believe something if it doesn't make sense or I'm not seeing it with my own eyes. And I think religion, specifically the belief in God and all of that, like I've never seen God.
Faith-based.
Yeah. So why should I believe this? And with what you're talking about science, I think a lot of that got commingled in that, which is people just started following something because Fauci said it. People just became sheep and started believing something because there was an agenda, and this became a political, tennis match as well, going back and forth. Well, I'm Republican, so I'm going to believe in this science, and I'm Democrat, so I'm going to believe in this science, and it just got all screwed up. It just got all mixed together, and I think that's happened with religion as well, which is people.
Well, my point is that because people need a connection to something greater than themselves, mm-hmm. and it's not necessarily the science that is the problem. It's actually humans. Humans they want to put their faith and belief in something. And one of the challenges of putting that into, let's say, science, or I almost hesitate to use the word science, because to your point, like the scientific method is different than the quote, like larger, greater science that is taken over and hijacked people's brains. The reality is we were told and given this idea that science is going to make things black and white, and either you're right or you're wrong. But that's just not the reality of the way that it works. There are many of these studies that people have changed the perspective of how humans have thought about the way the world works, that 20 years later are completely debunked, right? You look at this marshmallow study, really famous, about these kids that, these little kids, and some of them are given marshmallows and they're told not to eat the marshmallow. And if they don't eat the marshmallow, then later on they're going to be a kid that has more delayed gratification and they're going to be more successful. All of that's been debunked, right? They look back at the study, they're like, this just actually is complete nonsense. And that's where I think that's the challenge. My point here is that, like, I think the problem isn't necessarily science. I think it's humans, and humans have to put their belief in something. And we don't all have the ability to sit there and, look at the ins and outs of every scientific paper and figure out for ourselves if it's accurate or if it's false.
Well, I think that's what I'm getting at, is that in general, with this decline in religion, especially in the US, it's pretty correlated to our discovery in science too, which is are like, we're moving forward. We're building vehicles and the internet and supercomputers and quantum computing, and that's all, science based. But we've gotten to this point now where there's a lot of unexplained things, and there's a lot of things where we're scratching our heads more than we were originally because we've discovered more, and a lot of things are being debunked or challenged, just like the example you gave. And so this pendulum swinging back towards a more of a spiritual identity, or having this ability to put faith in something that you can't explain, you can't see it, but you're going to put your faith in it because it makes you feel better, it gives you purpose in life, and it's just a better way of living. I think that is where the US is headed. I'm not saying it's happening overnight, but I think we've kind of reached that bottom there. And the catalyst was this most recent thing with the pandemic, which is all kinds of stuff got screwed up, and people who were diehard believers in this one thing have been proven wrong, or they're sitting here scratching their head going, I don't really know what to think now.
Totally. Yeah, I don't know where we go from here. I think it's.
I got a personal anecdote.
Yeah.
I started going to church. I tell you this.
All right, tell us about it.
I didn't grow up religious. I could count probably the number of times I've been to church on one hand between the age of under 18.
Yeah.
I probably only went to church because I was at a friend's house and the family's going to church, and I was just kind of like a ride along for the day.
I mean, you're West Coast, Southern California.
Actually,
probably the lowest.
I probably went to a temple more than I went to church because I had a lot of Jewish friends growing up. All kinds of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and I could like recite the whole thing like Aru Katal. I'm not Jewish at all. But what I'm getting at is I go to church now, and here's the reason why. Well, we got invited by a family, so my kids' parents said, "Hey, why don't you come to church?" It was a weekend, Sunday, of course. Okay, let's go. So my wife and kids go there, and the beginning is this music. It was like this crazy production. It was almost over the top. It was like a rock band.
Is it a large church? We're talking big time.
No, it's not like a mega church. There's probably like a couple hundred people in there, but it's like super high production quality, clean, new. It's not what you would think of a church outside of the church. It's this huge building. You've got I don't know, what's it called where you sit, or the pews are and all that, but it's more like just regular seating. There's a stage.
I mean, I'm going to tell you, I'm not the right person to
outside that, there's
answer
like
this question. I don't think I even
shop. Yeah. There's like a coffee shop inside the church, and it feels like you're in like a giant living room, and then you go into where they're having the ceremony. Not ceremony. I don't even. It just shows how much I know about religion. Anyway, we go there. There's music. It's a little over the top for me, a little bit like people raising their hands and embracing God. But then that's about 20 minutes, and then after that, there's a 20-minute, 30-minute sermon. And the first time we sit in there, there's this sermon, and it's totally relevant to everyone's lives. It's talking about like egos and managing people who are in your life that are difficult to deal with, and how you separate that, and how you go out your day managing relationships. And I listened to it, and I was like, this is great. This is like a therapy session for me. And I just had to sit here and listen. But what was even more amazing is that every single child that was there, and every single family, they were nice, they were polite, they were respectable. All their kids were super nice. I want my kids to be around those kids because they're good influence. They're playing well in the playground together. They're looking at you in the eye saying, "Hi, how are you? Thank you." Just doing the things that I guess probably existed back in the early 19th century with kids in America, which I feel like now there's a lot of kids, especially when you have kids, you don't want your kids to be around brats. And there's a lot of brats out there. So going to church, I'm not like fully bought into the whole God thing yet. I'm struggling myself. But being around these people was very encouraging. And it made me think, like, where do I want to be physically, but also spiritually going forward with my life? Who do I want to surround myself with? Do I want to be around these people or other people who maybe are distracted all day long on their phone and have no North Star? I prefer the church people. I'm enjoying it. So we've been going to church, I don't know, a couple months now, every Sunday. There's some sermons I'm not super into, but the most of them I find very helpful. And I feel like we leave and I feel better for the day and I feel good for the week. And I think there's something about that cultures around the world, especially cultures that have low birth rates, are missing. I firmly believe that. And I do think that I hope it's going to go, the pendulum's going to swing back the other way where people realize they're missing something. They want that more wholesome family vibe, and maybe the birth rate will come up with that.
I mean, I think that there's a long history of that being relevant in society, right? Like we're in a short blip where it hasn't been the norm. And that's the part that's quite interesting. Like you, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in the least religious part of the country on an island off of Seattle where I didn't even know really anybody who went to church. And if they did go to church, they definitely didn't talk about it because it was not something that like was exciting or that you'd share in high school. Moved to Austin, Texas, and the experience of all my friends who grew up around the country, a lot of them grew up in the South, completely different, right? Church was a huge part of their life. I think the question that I have really, my wife and I have talked about a lot is like, what is going that like all the benefits like you're talking about are being around a good community, seeing people consistently. It's a very family friendly environment. I mean, my wife basically grew up in the church. She grew up going every single Sunday, at least. Extremely positive community environment. Is there going to be something like, what is going to replace that? Is it going to be the church, or is it going to be something entirely different that replicates a lot of the positive sides of the church without the baggage, right, that come with it?
I know I think everyone knows who's been listening to this. I'm a big surfer. And in the surfing world, most people think that surfers are drug addicts and drunkards and partiers. But the surfing culture community, actually a lot of surfers are Christians or they practice some sort of religion. And surfing for them, literally going out in the water is church, is being on your own or seeing your friends, being in nature,
connecting with nature.
Yeah, and feeling like you're living a clean life. I mean, like literally clean. You're in the water. You're cleansing yourself. You're in sunlight. There's not many complications around you. And I think you're asking if it's not church. I think there's things like that replace that, or at least supplement that church experience of having activities. And I think another thing that's come up a lot, and I know you're in one, is men's groups. Men don't typically talk about this. I don't think it's been something historically popular. It's kind of emasculating to think about, I'm in a men's group. I get together and talk about our feelings as a bunch of men. But that's something that's popped up a lot recently. And maybe that is going to take hold more. And whether that's a direct spiritual connection with a greater being, I'm not sure. But I do think that idea of coming together with like-minded people who want to talk about bettering their lives is something that society in general needs and is probably going to shift more towards, and perhaps that'll be more babies.
What's shifting towards most recently, what I think is very interesting, is the Manosphere.
What's that? I never even heard of that word.
The Manosphere.
What's that?
The Manosphere is this, like, you've seen it. It's the Andrew Tate type community of these, let's just say, like ultra masculine men that tell younger men how to live their life.
Yeah, he's like the orthodox, like mega masculine, like the Orthodox Jew, or Orthodox Christian, or whatever, extreme Muslim. Like he's that of the Manosphere.
But why is it taking hold? Right. This is where I think people
it's taking hold
really,
because it doesn't exist, and people are itching for that.
Exactly. And this is where I think it's fascinating to me. There's a lot of criticism of this Manosphere, right? There's people writing articles about how horrible it is, and that they're telling young men to be misogynistic. They're telling men to
they're telling young men that they are misogynistic. You're saying, right?
Well, they're telling men basically like, look out for yourself, take care of yourself, like go work hard, focus on getting things, focus on dialing in your life. Oh, that's what you're saying, like
Tate and those guys are saying.
That's what they're saying.
Okay.
Yes. And the criticism from a lot of people, specifically on like the left wing, if you're talking about like the journalist class, the Vox Media, who writes a lot of these hit pieces on this Manosphere and looks really far down on it, they're just missing the large component of why this has taken hold. And it's taken hold because people have a deep void of, especially young men, they're looking for something greater than themselves. And these people are offering a solution. Is it a perfect solution? No. And also it's a hypocritical solution, considering that most of these most of these guys are talking about the importance of family and all these different things, but they don't have families.
Yeah.
And they're like in their 40s and they're dating all these women, yet they're talking about how you shouldn't do that and that you should be like locked in, working, all these different things. It's just very, very interesting.
It's Huberman. Huberman was in that scandal where he was dating like 6 women at the same time. He has no kids. He's not married yet. He's like this longevity expert telling you how to live your life like the most healthy way possible. And you're like, dude, you're not even like
that's a perfect example of, again, science and religion. I will die on this hill that it's just replacing religion with a evidence-based belief system, right?
Yeah,
and
it's an equal and opposite reaction or some sort
follow
of
the protocols,
right?
Follow the belief system, right? Like it's the same thing. It's the same thing, and at the core, like humans just need more. Humans are striving for meaning, and especially young men. And this is why, back to the birth rate situation, and why it's so damaging to have these African nations with like 6-7 kids on average. All right, what do? There's going to be a massive destabilizing force in their country with all of these young men who don't have any meaning. Maybe they go to the church, and that's the thing that keeps them together. But more likely, they're going to be searching for something to do, and it's probably going to take root in a negative way.
Yeah, that's
history
Boko
tells us
Haram
anything.
in Nigeria, and
Exactly.
You look at, if you're growing up in that part of Africa, the Sahel region of Africa, there's those nations. We've named it before: Niger, Chad, Nigeria. The upper portion is in that region. Mali. There's not much North Star or future outlook out there. So what do they turn to? They turn to a hardcore version of Islam. And then you've got these sects like Boko Haram who are extremists. They go out and murder Christians, but they rally together all these men, and they have a mission to go out and
say, do you struggle with meaning in your life? Guess what? Come with us. We're going to train you. We're going to feed you. Mm-hmm. You're going to have, you're going to pray with us. Brotherhood, all these things.
And we're going to bash a bunch of Christians over the head.
Yeah, or outside of anybody who's not a non-believer, we're going to impose our will, right? We're going to impose our belief system on yours, and at the core, I think so much of this is related to just power and yeah, I really do have questions though about what is going to fill the void. I personally don't think that it's going to be Christianity. It's not going to come back and like fill that void. I think something else is going to come up, and that we don't necessarily know yet. That will replace it.
Well, I think that's what we're getting to right now. Maybe we'll give a little teaser that it's not necessarily Christian based. I mean, you think of the Catholic Church or a Lutheran church or whatever. It's more of this spiritual group coming together. That's something we're working on, right? To get like a trip together with a bunch of like-minded guys who want to be together, have an adventure, have something out there that is an accomplishment to complete with a brotherhood, and feel like you did something good, and then go back into your normal life and have this inspiration that you just did with a bunch of great guys, and try and keep that at some sort of repetitious schedule throughout your life. And again, for a lot of people, historically, that's been the church every Sunday. It may not be every Sunday, maybe it's a monthly thing. I think that's what we're working on, right?
It is. I'll be clear that it's not religious, but
it's not
religious based. Yeah.
I'm just saying historically, people have gone to the church, just like we talked about in Africa. That's like the only thing. Like, I guess I'll just go with these guys because they're the only ones kind of offering me any direction. I think the future is these other groups, and when I say spiritual, I don't mean like religion spiritual. I mean someone's in their gut. They viscerally feel like they want to go after something because it makes them feel good inside.
Perfect example of this 50-mile walk that we're doing, right? There's not what is the spiritual component of a 50-mile walk? Well, it feels good to do challenging things and accomplish things, and it's something that gives you some level of fear around. All right, that's going to be a hard thing to do, but on the other end of it, I'm going to feel really, really accomplished. And I think that's kind of the core of what we're talking about, is that we both believe firmly that the times when you feel most alive are when you're in connection with other people, doing challenging things and pushing yourself to the next level and learning, growing, and are around other people that believe the same thing. And that's why you and I do this podcast together.
Yep.
One of the reasons is that we both believe in the power of adventure, the power of travel, the power of community, and the power of doing hard things. And
this is like our men's group that people get to listen into.
It is. It is. And I don't think, you talked about men's groups being emasculating. I think that's like one of the problems of like a stereotypical men's group of men's getting together and talk about their feelings.
Men's, yeah. Get the men's
I don't
together.
think it's what's that?
Nothing. It sounded funny. You said men's. I like that.
Oh, getting men together. Yeah. Getting men together. I think that the reality is a better version of a men's group is you get together and you have an equal amount of fun and go through and have challenging conversations, or you break, it's not about just getting there and opening up and sharing your feelings. It's about being in connection and having some perspective on your life. I think I'll share just like the biggest difference between men and women in my limited life experience is that men crave to be able to share things that they're going through and actually get some level of perspective or feedback on what they're going through with some validation. On the flip side, with women, generally, they crave validation for what they're going through with a very limited, maybe shift in perspective. And so at the core, when I think about like what a men's group is or what the value I've got out of a men's group has been the perspective from other people that I trust on things that I'm going through to make it easier to get to the other side. And I think you talked about the sermon, right, at church. It's like, what's the value in that? You come and you sit down and you listen to someone share a different perspective on how to navigate the trials and tribulations of life that every single person shares. And an interesting business idea or a business that I heard about recently that I thought immediately, I was like, this is such a good scalable business. There's a guy who is just like an absolute legendary sermon writer. And every single week he puts out a sermon. It goes out on a Wednesday, and all these pastors subscribe and they pay I think it's like $15 a month or something like that. Every Wednesday, they get a sermon in the mail. They get from Wednesday to Sunday to customize it for themselves. This guy's writing at scale like 10,000 or like 50,000 of the sermons that go out every single Sunday. All he has to do, he wakes up, he uses his superpower, which is write an incredible sermon. Boom, goes out there at scale. Incredible business model.
That's what we're doing, right?
What's that?
That's what we're doing, right? That's what we're trying to do. Like, I don't know, have inspirational conversations with the people doing
No, I'm just saying we're not monetizing it the way as this guy is. This guy's got a hell of a business. This guy's got a hell of a business out there. There's no cost. He writes it, he emails it, and I think he's pulling in millions of dollars a month based off of this.
Good for him.
This business. Yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it. So I think we can kind of wrap up here. A teaser of what's coming. Yeah, we are putting together an event. It's going to be a really unique, incredible event for men. And over the next couple of weeks and months, you'll learn more about it as we talk about it on the podcast. It's going to be something that is going to, one, be incredibly fun and challenging. It's going to push you in ways that you probably didn't know that you wanted to be pushed. What I mean by that is just being outside in a way that you typically don't get a chance to be. And yeah, we're really, really excited about it. So we will share more. We'd love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed this episode, if you were shouting at your YouTube screen, being like, I disagree with you, tell us, shoot us an email, and we would love to hear from you. Hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and we will talk to you on the next episode.